The coalition government in Norway has collapsed, or the coalition has dissolved, basically because of a disagreement about energy policy. And this tells us a lot about what's happening with energy in Europe and what's going to happen in Great Britain, because we're about to embark down a similar path to what Norway did. So Norway is in the European Economic Area, but it's not part of the EU. And in order to keep access to the European single market, it needs to follow certain rules, including rules about its long-term strategy for decarbonisation of its energy system. And some of those rules can come into conflict with what Norway wants as a country, to be able to stay independent and provide good quality of living for its citizens. And basically, Norway is a highly electrified country in terms of energy use, especially domestically. So domestic heating is electrified, lots of electrified transport. And most of their electricity comes from hydroelectric power. So they've got lots of water dams that generate electricity. And a lot of their country's wealth, however, comes from the offshore oil and gas exploration. So Equinor is the national energy company. It maybe partly privatized now, but Equinor basically run lots of oil and gas projects in the North Sea, and they use that to basically make money for the country by exporting oil and gas. Equinor now do a lot of wind turbine projects as well, wind farms and floating wind farms and things like that. But typically the country is quite green in terms of its domestic energy usage, so it's a lot of electricity from hydropower, but its exports are essentially a lot of oil and gas. So since the energy crisis, due to the invasion of Ukraine, Norwegian gas flows are the largest of any into the EU. So a lot of the EU's natural gas now comes from Norway instead of being flowed directly from Russia. Obviously, some still comes, I think, from Russia through third and fourth countries, but a lot of the natural gas that Europe needs for its heating and its industry comes from Norway. And Norway obviously wants to be able to stay independent. It's not part of OPEC, which is the sort of coalition of oil-producing countries that's the sort of against or in balance with America. But it basically wants to maintain its own ability to manage its own energy policy. And several times in the last few decades, energy policy has basically been the sort of downfall of successive governments, because they try and balance the sort of external needs of the relations with other countries and the internal needs with relation with their own country. So what's happening now is that Norway's got what's called zonal pricing. So Norway's a long, thin country, and it means that it's quite hard to, not hard, but you've got a transmission network which takes electricity up and down the country. And that's very expensive to run because it's a very long country, and obviously electricity transmission becomes less efficient the longer distance you have to do it. And so at some point, I believe it was early 2000s, they deregulated the electricity market the same way they've done in the UK or in Great Britain and in lots of places in the world. And basically means that every individual company, like grid operators or electricity generators, all became separate companies that could compete to provide services. And one of the ways that they tried to incentivize private investment to reduce costs was zonal pricing. So they originally did it because the transmission of electricity was very expensive. So now there's different zones in the country, and the way the market clears every day is that there's an overall clearing, and then each zone, it will be re-cleared based on transmission constraints. What it means is that in some zones you get more expensive electricity than in other zones, and that filters through to people's bills in their house. Now, the point of doing that is to set up a system where if you've consistently got high electricity prices in one area, then you might get individual or private companies building generation or storage units in that area, or you might incentivize industry in low price areas. But during that whole thing, the customers are quite vulnerable to basically being stuck in a place because you live there or you own a house and you have to pay these high electricity prices. So although leading, although creating incentives in order to create private investment is probably an efficient way to mobilize private capital. It can lead individual consumers in a bad position for several years, and I think this is largely what's been behind the downfalls of different governments when they've been trying to deal with energy policy. Because at the end of the day, Norwegian citizens, although they've got quite a good social contract, everyone wants cheap electricity. And now basically the European Union has got lots of wide projects that have been quite beneficial for green energy in order to move all the countries to a low carbon economy. But some of those directives can directly interfere with the country's own interests, especially when the countries aren't actually in the EU. They're just neighbours and taking part in, for example, the single market. Now, zonal pricing is relevant to GB because the National Grid has just done basically a multi-year consultation with all the energy companies in the country and groups representing consumers and these sort of things. It's called Rema, REMA, and the point of it was to figure out how to overhaul the electricity markets to benefit the net zero move and to basically make it happen faster. And one of the main findings is, should we go zonal pricing or not? And I think it's still in debate, but it's looking like we might go to zonal pricing in the UK, which would mean different areas of the country would have different electricity prices. Now, I think lots of consumers maybe think this is a good idea because if you live next to a wind farm or you've had to have a wind farm built on your local hill, you say, I shouldn't be paying high electricity prices because I'm next to a wind farm. This can be the case when you're benefiting directly from low power prices in your area. However, the problem with GB as a country is that it's highly interconnected. So, and this links back to what's happening in Norway. So, Norway basically has electricity that's provided by hydroelectric power, like I said, and that power is reliable because it's always on. So they don't have to deal with the hour-to-hour fluctuations of energy generation from wind and solar. The problems that they have to deal with are more long-term and seasonal. So, for example, is there enough snow on the mountains that will run into the hydroelectric reservoirs that will then have enough water to power our electricity? So they've got to think about more sort of long-term seasonal variations in the power supply, whereas in countries where we've got lots of renewables like wind and solar, they have to think about hour-to-hour power fluctuations and how you get through those. And so Norway has basically has interconnectors. So one of the interconnectors connects directly from Norway's system to Great Britain's system, and this is a cable. It doesn't directly couple the power systems, but it sends electricity from one to the other, and on either end it essentially acts like a power plant that's either pushing energy in or taking energy out of the system. Now what this does is it couples the electricity markets as well. So if there's a high price in one area and a low price, one country, and a low price in another country, the electricity is supposed to flow from high to low prices, which means that high prices caused by all sorts of things in one country can be contagious into the other country, which is good for overall European system, electricity system, low carbon, because it basically allows us to run on a system where if one country has a surplus of energy, they can send energy to another, and potentially it could all be renewable energy. But in terms of a country's own individual investment and return on investment for their citizens, it can be quite bad, because Norway has been, some ministers of Norway have said, for example, that the neighbouring countries like, Great Britain, because it's got an interconnector, and the neighbouring countries, maybe Denmark, have gone highly reliable on wind energy, but they've already been able to do that because Norway is able to flow energy to them when they don't have wind energy, and basically using Norway as a backup for that. Now that's a problem because Norway can just decide to not participate in that anymore. So, for example, what's happening now is that the government has suggested a situation where they'll basically roll out a whole new energy policy in terms of consumers and say, okay, we're going to go 1 year fixed electricity prices for consumers, we're going to subsidise electricity prices, and we're just going to have to pay for that in some way. And that can basically cause the Norwegian government to have to then alter their entire outward-facing energy policy, which could have serious ramifications for the EU. So because we use a lot of Norwegian gas and because we use a lot of Norwegian power, electricity that is, that could potentially stop in the future. So Norway could, as an independent country, they could decide to stop flowing electricity through the interconnector between Norway and Great Britain. If that happens, Great Britain would essentially lose the equivalent of one of its largest power plants. Now, that's not necessarily going to cause a blackout straight away, but it is going to cause squeeze on our system. And if Norway stops flowing gas to the EU, it's going to significantly increase gas prices in the UK, and that could also disrupt our ability to run a secure system. And so Norway has a lot of power, and just because its neighbouring countries want to go highly flexible electricity generation and supply and have individual customers basically have to adapt to that flexibility, doesn't mean that Norway has to go all that way with it. So one of its neighbouring countries, Denmark, also has a lot of investment in wind energy, and because of that they've done a lot of investment in how to run an electricity system very efficiently with wind energy. So lots of electricity trading and high frequency electricity trading, so dealing with fluctuations of output from electricity generation on the minute scale, and they've been doing that for a couple decades now. And basically they've set up their whole electricity system to be flexible and allow energy companies to trade electricity very quickly, and this kind of setup can lead to the adoption of wind energy onto the grid, and also building of storage and things like this. But it could lead to high electricity prices for consumers, especially poorest consumers. And at some point the consumers can say, we had enough of this. And then what position are you in then? You've basically built your entire grid around an idea. When the idea is no longer palatable to the people that actually live in the country, then you have to find a new way of doing that. So I think that this is good. What's happening now is a good reminder that you can't just continue down one road of policy without constantly seeing if this is actually working for the average consumer and the average citizen of the country. Now, what's happening with interconnectors especially is that because you've got this zonal pricing, the zone that the interconnector actually comes into the country at will be significantly affected in terms of its pricing by the what's happening in the other country completely. And this could basically mean that one area of the country that has an interconnector is just subject to massive price swings, and it becomes unlivable for domestic consumers. And again, this might be efficient in the short term, but if the tide turns against this politically, then the government has to basically do something that the citizens will find okay, and that could basically be paying for the inefficiencies through taxation, which again would fall to everyone and then would probably end up being not as efficient. So it might be more beneficial to think about energy security over 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years, rather than it is to think about low carbon, low price in the next decade or 2 decades. So the move, Norway essentially is doing something towards energy security, and this is part of this idea of the energy trilemma, where you want safe energy, reliable energy, and cheap energy. And even the obviously safe part of safe is like having energy that doesn't ruin the environment, but the other parts of the trilemma are very important to everyone: reliability and price. And so reliability and price are the ones that most often come into direct conflict, because to have a very reliable system is very expensive. But basically reliability can go from a grid point of view, but it can also be from a resources flow point of view. And we've seen that with the war in Ukraine. Europe was having a gas security problem. They couldn't necessarily get a lot of gas into the country, and they'd have to pay high prices on the global market to get liquefied natural gas into the country and flow gas from Norway. And basically what's happening in the USA and what's happening in Norway right now, and also what's been happening recently in the UK, is that each of these countries are thinking we need to concentrate on the security part of the energy trilemma and really think about how we can actually have secure energy for the country. Does that mean that because we do use a lot of gas, that we have to produce it locally. So in the UK, we've got a couple of gas projects like Jackdaw that have recently been blocked because of climate protests. But those sorts of projects can actually make sure that some of our gas demand in the UK is produced locally, and that essentially protects our customers from massive price swings and potentially unsafe grid conditions, blackouts, etc., based on lack of resources. So although obviously you overall want to get the safe part for having a low carbon electricity system that's actually going to be good for the environment, you always need to balance it against security and low price, because those things actually affect people in the short term and in the long term. You can easily probably bankrupt your country by going for risky energy provision. I think that's what I wanted to talk about in this context. So if we go to zonal pricing through the new Rema in the UK, we might see situations where parts of the country have incredibly high electricity prices. And the other part is that even if you're sitting there thinking, well, I've got a wind farm down the road, I know wind energy is cheap, I should be experiencing low energy prices with this Rema and zonal pricing. The problem with that is that the zonal pricing only makes an effect on the electricity price if your area is in a congested part of the network. So the transmission constraints are low. So as in there's not any blockages on the transmission lines. So you might not have any control about this. So it might be low. It might be that you've got you're right next to a power plant and you suffer the consequences of that. But actually, because your area is quite well connected to the rest of the grid, you don't actually benefit from low prices overall, because the prices aren't. It's not about direct compensation between inconvenience and electricity price. So it's not about compensating you directly for having to look at a power plant every day. It's actually a sort of more national level thing where they're just trying to incentivize build out of capacity and industry in different locations. So it could be a situation where there's different ways. I mean, with wind farms, you can already get compensated directly for having a wind farm in your location. So often if someone's trying to build a wind farm on your local hill, they'll run consultations with the locals, and they sometimes literally directly pay you a small amount of money to have for the inconvenience. They might invest in the local community, etc. Rema will be essentially taking that away, and it's kind of potluck whether you actually get a benefit of having a power plant in your area. It's all to do with how the network is already built, which you obviously didn't have a say about anyway. So again, it's a bit less control there, because they're trying to do this essentially to get rid of the amount of power plants that are blocked by NIMBYism, like not in my backyard. But part of not in my backyard is people wanting a fair deal for what's happening to them. So if I live in a place and I own it, my house maybe, and I plan to live here for a long time and with my family, and someone wants to build a power plant there, not in my backyard is saying, okay, if you want to build that, then I need some money, or I just don't want it at all. I think in those sorts of situations, and this is a large debate about libertarianism versus socialism or state control. It's like people want a say, but often people will be okay with something happening as long as they're compensated for it fairly. So it could be that in Rema you'll get winners and losers, and just because you think you might be a winner doesn't mean you will be, because it's about network capacity, not about how close you are to the power plant. And in future videos I can talk about how congestion actually works on transmission networks, and how in liberalized energy markets this sort of market clearing actually happens. So most electricity markets in Europe have been liberalized, which means that investment and daily prices are determined through market mechanisms. But for example, in Norway, like the power plants and to a large extent the transmission network will have been built originally by a centralized government-owned electricity company. So whether actually liberalizing energy markets is beneficial overall is yet to be seen. I mean, in the short term, it can lead to low prices and also rollout of low carbon with the right government subsidies. But in the long run, it might impact everyone's lives, consumers, in a negative way. can lead to unrest and basically scrapping all the gains in it in favour of fairness again, which is through taxation. So every country has its own sort of balance of this, and normally based on its own resources. So, for example, Norway wouldn't have been able to become wealthy as it is without the ability to extract its oil and gas and sell that around the world. So even though they might be an example of a low carbon country, these sorts of interplays with politics and consumer opinions is really interesting, because it reveals how essentially everyday citizens want quality of life, and that comes from cheap energy, and also the importance of having a country that is wealthy, that is able to produce and export stuff that other countries want, or is able to do something that maintains their wealth, like be a centre for financial services, or provide military intervention or influence across the world. Those things are very important when we think about individual citizens' quality of life. And so it's a really interesting time in electricity policy. We are, again, as I said, Great Britain's got 10 interconnectors now. So we're connected to the island of Ireland twice, which is a different electricity system, but we're connected with these interconnectors, which are direct current, DC, whereas the main electricity grid is AC. We're also connected with probably get this wrong, France, Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, to an Ireland, and there's a bunch of others. I think there's 3 to France, and there might be 2 to, I forget. Well, we've got 10 anyway. One of them, Greenlink, has just come online recently, so that one will be flowing this year. And we're going to see basically the impact of the project of liberalized electricity markets across Europe, where every country has its own sort of historic investments and infrastructure, but the overall picture is one of zonal management and overall electricity prices. So again, the European electricity grid is one synchronous electricity grid. So Norway's connected to Denmark's connected to, I'm going to get my geography wrong, Germany is connected to Sweden obviously as well, and is connected, and then that whole system is also connected all the way down to Morocco and as far east into Ukraine. So during the war, Ukraine connected to the electricity system of Europe. So it's the largest interconnected one AC alternating current electricity system in the world. Great Britain is its own electricity system, and then Ireland is its own one. But all those 3 are connected by these interconnectors, which don't directly couple power plants, but they act as sort of bridges between the 2, and electricity can flow either way, and on either end it acts like a power plant. So this is a project where we have different different markets affecting different zones. You also have different control areas and different European Union wide bodies and like multi-country governing bodies that manage power flows and network constraints and networks into these different countries. And it's a large scale project of cooperation, but also of economics. And some countries are going to be winners and some losers, and some countries are going to feel like their investment in their own infrastructure is being exploited by other countries, and but it's going to incentivize things like flexible use and generation of electricity, which can be good for net zero but can be bad for consumers as well, and also different fuel projects. So the fact that the European energy system is so interconnected will allow these large scale projects, and that's part of why the EU is able to do and willing to do these large renewable projects, is to do things like push forward things like sustainable aviation fuel or methods of creating hydrogen from renewable energy. These kind of projects are so capital intensive and like cooperation intensive, as well as carbon capture and storage, that they really require massive countries to be able to do it. So the USA can do it. I mean, part of the Inflation Reduction Act was incentivizing things like underground carbon storage, so CCUS, carbon capture and underground storage, and incentivizing renewable infrastructure through tax breaks as well. But in the EU, we can do things like fund research into hydrogen and research into other storage techniques. And you do need those large-scale corporations and buy-in from large energy companies to be able to do that. But no matter how much buy-in you have and how many people are interested in these projects, you have to remember that these individual countries and the individual corporations like Shell or BP or Equinor, they all potentially have their own set of interests. So the countries have their interests, which represent the citizens, hopefully, and then all these companies have their own interests. And no matter how big of a agreement you might have between them, essentially they're always going to look after their own interests in the interests of long-term survival. So it's going to be a fascinating time in the next few decades in energy, and hopefully I'll be able to commentate and give some more background as to what's happening. So yeah, look up Norway energy situation and keep up to date with what's happening, because it might have influences in Great Britain. Thanks a lot, and subscribe please.